Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Finding You podcast. This is Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is Tuesday, October 22nd, 2024. Today, I'm going to be talking about projections and your mental health. I thought about this after the last broadcast when I was talking about marriage and how much weight, how much material we project onto our partner, how much we ask them to do our work, that we marry the person that is our unfinished business. Sometimes they're a compliment to us. Sometimes they seem to be in line with us, but in many cases, every relationship that we have, every intimate relationship we have, is an opportunity to transform, to stretch ourselves, to become larger. As I was thinking about that broadcast and talking about, there's a quote actually on here, one quote on here tonight that I use in that broadcast where I talk about projections. I just became aware about how often I'm thinking about projections and the process that is involved in projections, the defense of projections, and what happens before that. I think about this all the time. And I'm reminded of my earliest days in therapy. I've told this before that when I was a new client in therapy, there were times in those early years back in the late 1990s where my therapist would say something about my family of origin, about my mother, about my father. And I remember thinking really explicitly, first of all, it didn't land. It didn't hit. It didn't really resonate with me. And often I would think she doesn't have enough information, enough background. I haven't told stories in enough detail for her to make that observation or that interpretation. I think she might be off, or at least it just didn't feel like it was important or a priority in terms of understanding my own mental health and well-being. Of course, as years went on, it became clear to me that what she saw was in fact what was happening inside of me, and that because she could see the way that I was today, she knew what my past was like in large part. She might not be able to identify and describe every aspect of my parents' personality, but she saw where the project had failed. She saw where what needs I had that went unmet and how I was trying to get those met today. There was a lot of talk in those early days about this idea of what we'll call the bad object from object relations, about how one doesn't like the feeling inside of oneself, and so we project it out into the other person. The most classic example that I give to illustrate this is from my own past, from my own upbringing, is I often felt like, number one, I was too needy, that I was dramatic, and I was too sensitive. These are words that my mother used to describe me in moments of frustration, which I understand. But really, what those statements were a confession of her own sense of inadequacy, her own sense of being overwhelmed. And because where she was at in her life, because she had not evolved, because she couldn't see what was hers and what was mine, she projected the problem out on me. In other words, instead of feeling inadequate and not up to the task, or feeling guilty and like she was a failure for not meeting my needs, I was the problem. I was too needy. So that's what led into me wanting to do this. I love this quote from the Gospel of St. Thomas. The Gospel of St. Thomas, for those of you who don't know, comes from the Dead Sea Scrolls that were discovered in the late 1940s. And on one of these scrolls found in a cave, they found what appears to be one of a gospel written by somebody that was in Jesus Christ's presence. What's interesting about the Gospel of St. Thomas and all the Gnostic Gospels is that it sounds a lot more like Buddhism than it does like the way we hear about Christianity today. In other words, it talked about the psychological and spiritual process of being born again, of understanding and knowing God, of surrender, of all the things that we talk about, not in a symbolic way, but really in a spiritual way, talking about it and describing it. So from the Gospel of St. Thomas, we read, if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. I think that's incredibly powerful place to start tonight. That part of what projections will give us, and I'll talk about this idea this evening, is they give us a sense what is unconscious. Mahatma Gandhi said one time, the only devils in the world are those running around in our own hearts. We project the devil out there. We think that evil is out there. And we fight our battles out there. We can see that in the world today when it comes to to wars, when it comes to religions, when it comes to races and countries, when it comes to the tendency, even in our own country, to other the other side of the political party. It's very triggering for so much of us. We feel so much hurt and so much pain on either side of the aisle. And to manage this sense of powerlessness, again, we other the person. We create the other person to be our enemy. We imagine them to be the one that is causing all of our distress and all of our troubles. So let's start with defenses and trauma. This comes from another broadcast that I've done in years past. And I want to explain it just this simple way. Whatever the threat is, whether it be hurt, sadness, abandonment, attack, whatever the threat is. And oftentimes, I think of the threat principally as a threat to my belonging, my desirability, whether or not I'm worthy of connection, whether or not I'm interesting, compelling, whether or not I'm wanted and loved. Because we know from our own biology, our own DNA, and where we descended, that if we were left on our own, we would die. If we didn't have the support of the family, of the group, of the tribe, we couldn't survive the elements. We couldn't survive. We couldn't feed ourselves. We would be overwhelmed. And what makes us so, over thousands and thousands of years, so successful as a species on this planet is our desire to group together, our want to group together. So those of us who were pulled magnetically toward the group, toward each other, those people survived long enough to pass on their genes and raise children who then passed on their genes. Those of us who had little or no desire or were outcast for whatever antisocial behavior there was, those people didn't live long enough to pass on their genes, or were less likely to raise children who could pass on their gene. So the defense, the threat is that we're going to be kicked out, that we're not going to belong, that we're not going to be loved. That's the threat. And the defense is this wall that we put up in the face of this defense, or this perceived threat that we experience. And that's really, the defense has all kinds of names. It can be substance abuse, it can be depression, it can be eating disorders. The list of mental health symptoms organized in patterns that we call defenses are all an attempt to ward off the threat. They keep us and the other people distracted from those uncomfortable, threatening feelings. This is why people want their loved ones to go to treatment. This is why we enter treatment, because we have these debilitating defenses, these symptoms, these patterns of coping and warding off pain and fear and guilt and shame and the threat. We have these patterns that we call diagnoses. You know, when I hear people talk today, and there's a big movement in popular psychology today to talk about the fact that it's not so much genetics, it's a lot about context. You know, I've done a review on the book, What Happened to You, or The Myth of Normal by Gabor Mate. There's a lot of pop psychologists talking about how context shapes us. And I am a big fan of understanding how the context shape us. I'm a big fan of understanding our own experience from our family of origin. I know from the research, from theory, from my own practice, that understanding and unraveling those patterns help us heal. But there's also a genetics component. And anybody who says it's one or the other is obviously missing the whole picture. It's never always genetics and never always the environment, but it's a combination of both. There's the given, what we come into this world with, and then there's the made, how it shapes us. We have proclivities, we have vulnerabilities, and then the environment acts on us, and then we begin to display, if I'm talking about mental illness, symptoms in our preferred style. We fashion our defenses and our symptoms and our mental illness, unconsciously, of course, in the way that best fits us, that best serves us. We have innate strengths, propensities, and vulnerabilities also. It's not just the weaknesses. It's not just our predispositions to addiction, for example. But we also have strengths. In fact, in many cases, the strength and the weakness are the other side of the same coin. People with depression can be very warm and empathic and patient with other people. People who have ADHD can be very hyper-focused at times, can be very creative, can think outside of the box. People that are on the spectrum can, for example, be good at the STEM subjects. Batman, the myth of Batman, the story of Batman, who saw his parents murdered in front of him, became a superhero, a vigilante defending people who couldn't defend themselves. So our stories and our myths illustrate this idea that our wounds and our gifts lie down next to each other each night. What we're trying to do is solve the problem of pain with these defenses, protect ourselves, ward it off. And the thing I always find to be so fascinating, even in my own life, is that our first instinct when somebody raises a defense is to attack it. I teach this to therapists. I have a master class that I teach on attachment-based therapy. I talk about this. People agree with it in theory. I agree with it in theory. And yet a common impulse is to try to break through, to try to tear down somebody's wall, to steal their crutches. When instead, the most effective method is to help them feel safe so they don't need the wall. I try not to confront people's defenses when I see them, but what I try to do in my therapy practice is be with people in such a way that they feel safe enough to lower the defenses. Part of why I self-disclose so much on this podcast and in the work that I do, number one, I do my own work, so I make sure that I process it there. But I self-disclose to disarm the defense, to let people know I'm not speaking from above, from a throne, from my academic ivory tower. I'm speaking person to person. Often I shared on a podcast that I was interviewed on today. I'm really often just teaching things that I was thinking about last week or learning just a month ago. I'm doing the same thing for you that somebody else did for me. So our defenses have a style to them. There are some people that use, for example, an eating disorder or compulsive eating to manage their stress, their fear, their threat. There are some people that use alcohol or gambling or self-harm or dramatic behavior or buying and shopping in excess, and the list goes on. And we might have more than one of these kinds of defenses, these styles. But these styles of defenses, this way becomes a pattern. And if you look close enough and you see this pattern, you can describe it in this shorthand that we call a diagnosis. So that's the idea of the defense. The defense is there. The defense is something that we can honor as therapists, as parents, and as partners. But to do it as a partner or as a parent, we have to make sure that we're feeding ourselves. We have to make sure that we have the capacity, because it requires great capacity, right? The master therapist is the therapist who listens. The compassionate healer is the one who is patient, the one who is empathic, the one who can see past the smokescreen, see past the red herring, the distraction, and into the person. And we don't always expose them. I think that's one of the temptations that novices have as they get some psychotherapy and some tools, some awareness, is they use their X-ray vision. I know I've done it many times. I live in a family of therapists, so I'm very familiar with how the psychology and the tools can be weaponized. And I remember years ago when my therapist said to me regarding my oldest, she said, he needs his dignity. You need to proceed in such a way that he can preserve that. And I thought I was doing something bold and courageous by just calling it what it was. But the fact of the matter, the fact that I looked through his defense, past his defense, and described him because I had the psychological wherewithal to diagnose or see him or to identify the fear, the insecurity, the hurt beneath it, I thought I was doing something helpful. And of course, all that happened is the wall got larger, more fortified. It makes sense, doesn't it? If you built a wall around you to protect you and someone came and attacked it, it doesn't matter if they told you it was for your own good. It doesn't matter if they tried to convince you that the wall was keeping you stuck inside of the prison that you had built for yourself. If they couldn't understand you, if they couldn't see you, if they weren't willing to lay down their weapons of wall destruction, maybe even take off their armor, maybe recognize their own defenses, their own wall. If they weren't able to do that, there was no way we were letting the wall down. No matter how hard they tried, we built it up stronger. We launched a counter offensive attack, or we simply left the city we had built with the walls that it had and found a new place to build a new city with walls. So what happens is there are aspects of you that they don't fit in. They're a threat to your parents, to your teachers, to your siblings, to your community, your family of origin, your extended family, whatever it is. You present with something. And somebody bigger than you is threatened by that, upset by that. You cry too much. Or in other words, you cry in such a way that the other person feels triggered by the crying, the sound of your crying. So they get angry, or they punish you, or they ignore you. And you learn that crying isn't getting you what you need. I mean, it's the one thing that humans have from birth to get their needs met. And yet we call newborn babies who don't cry good babies. We don't really call the ones that cry a lot bad, but we imply it. So the baby cries, the child cries, the young adult cries, the adult cries, and people reject them. They shame them. You're too needy. You're dramatic. You have this diagnosis or that diagnosis. And we learn real quickly, mostly through the unspoken interactions, that part of me needs to go away. I need to repress it. I need to bury it. So I block it out of my personality. I split it off of me and place it somewhere in the unconscious, in my psychological closet, if you will. And I imagine that trait is now gone, that it doesn't exist. Because I was principally abandoned as a child, I didn't have cruel parents or mean parents or toxic or intrusive parents. That wasn't my particular trauma. It was more that they were just unavailable and overwhelmed with their own process. They still were children to a large degree all the way until their latter years. And so they were unavailable to me in a large sense. So I learned not to need. I learned that my needs would go unmet. And so I convinced myself, I learned it, I don't need anything. And then, of course, I spent my whole life trying to get my needs met in passive-aggressive ways, in unconscious ways, through acting out or substance use or food, through conflict, through fighting, through whatever I could to get those needs met, because I couldn't own them. I couldn't bring them out and walk out the front door with them. They were hidden in my shadow. I remember so many years ago, almost 20 years ago, a mother was describing to me her experience of feeling vulnerable because she needed. She was calling her parent mentor in a program that she had enrolled her family in. And she didn't want her parent mentor to know her name. She didn't want her parent mentor to meet her face to face because she was ashamed. And yet she ended up calling her parent mentor over and over and again, day after day. And finally, her parent mentor said to her, "You keep telling me that you're fine, that you don't have any needs, that you can be okay, but yet you're calling me a lot." People who can't ask for needs met, they steal. So then I stole my needs. And I get very defensive. If you call me needy, if I ask for what I need and you sigh in any kind of minor exasperation, my shame is triggered. The part of me that I have split off, the part of me that I have buried, the part of me that I put into the unconscious. And here's one of the tricks. When you take that part and you bury it, it takes energy with it. You can become depressed. It takes part of my life force, part of my libido, part of what makes me me. When I started coming really waking up to this process in my early 40s, late 30s, creativity increased. I was able to write my book. I became a better speaker. I became a better therapist, a better husband, a better father, a better friend. Because once I was able to reintegrate, to reincorporate the part of me that I had denied, that I had split off, it brought back with it a whole bunch of energy and light. And this is a lifelong journey. This is something that I am still working on to this day. So we organize our defenses into a particular style. A pattern of defenses becomes predictable, cemented, and ultimately a diagnosis can be formed. Trauma can be defined as anything less than ideal, right? We have small traumas like stubbing our toe and big traumas like the death of somebody that we love. We have traumas that are acting upon us and traumas like I described in myself where needs just weren't met, where there was an absence. Trauma changes the brain and can reduce access to reasoning. We get into fight or flight. We get into a pattern of fight or flight. Everything becomes a threat. So our ability to reason, to problem solve, to be creative, to be flexible, to think about the future, all becomes compromised. Of course, the trick in therapy, the trick that we try to accomplish in all of our Finding You programs, the trick is to look past or beneath the defenses to find the wound. When I teach therapists, I say, look for the crying child. Look for the hurt child. Look for the scared child. I love some of the exercises we do at our Finding You workshop when we ask individuals to have a psychodrama, a role play with somebody who sits in for their own child, their own inner child. And I love it when the individual starts to ask the child, how are you feeling? How are you doing? I want to hear about you. Because that's what the child needs. The child needs to be themselves and to have the parent take in what the child is offering, metabolize it, and reflect back a sense that you're okay. It's going to be okay. We call that co-regulation. And the child begins to make sense out of themselves. If that happens consistently and long enough, the child begins to internalize that sense of safety. This is how attachment becomes a permanent structure inside the psyche. Is then we go out into the world farther and farther away from our home base, farther and farther away from our caregiver, and we feel safe. The bird that sits on the end of a thin branch, as somebody once said, doesn't sit there confidently because it trusts the branch. It sits there confidently because it trusts its wings. Recently, when I had to pivot in my professional career, very recently, I was able to access that earned attachment that I've received in the process of therapy. I knew I was going to be okay. I knew it was going to be okay, even though it was a great loss and a great bit of grief and a big unknowing transition for me. So we find the wound and we help the client tell the story. That's really what it is. Tell the story of your life. Tell us what it's been like to be you. And if they can't tell the story, we try to help them. We try to tell their loved ones the story so that everybody understands what's going on for the individual. And that's how healing occurs. In the 12-step circles and language, they talk about it in terms of you're only as sick as your secrets. There's a pop psychology phrase that is often used that says, if it is named, it can be tamed. The great Fred Rogers would talk about the fact that if you can just speak it, if you can just talk about it, it becomes manageable. And as we learn to tell our story over and over again, we get clear about what it is asking of us and the people that we love, the people that we're close to. So the process of projection, Melanie Klein was a psychoanalyst, and she's made large contributions to object relations theories, to child development, to the psychological development of human beings. And she described that there are two stages that human beings go through She said the first stage is the paranoid stage or the paranoid phase. And that is where the threat is out there. The problem is out there, right? I need to manage my life and make it safe. People that don't receive adequate attachment experiences stay in that mode for their entire life. That's why you listening, try to control other people and circumstances, children, spouses. Instead of being present and connected and relying on that internal state that comes from a secure attachment, we have to control the world. I heard a congressman, actually, who was an active member of Codependence Anonymous, who used the phrase to teach on TV that instead of trying to carpet the world, he's learning for himself and for his children to teach them how to build moccasins, to give them shoes so they can walk around in the world. That's this idea of carrying around with you a sense of safety, a sense of home. And that happens in relationship to another person. There's a misunderstanding about this idea that self-esteem and self-worth and a sense of self comes from the inside, comes from inside of you. That's not how human beings are built. If a child is traumatized or abandoned significantly, chronically throughout their childhood, there is no well to draw from. And while all of us might not fit that dire description that I just gave, we're all somewhere on the continuum, somewhere in the middle part of the continuum. The way we develop a sense of self is through another person. The key is to find somebody that can see all of you compassionately, patiently, empathically. And then when that happens, then it becomes something internal. Then self-esteem and sense of self comes from the inside. But if you are chronically abused, you don't have that. It's not a cognitive, intellectual, academic process. It's an experience. If it happens in childhood, this positive attachment experience, this positive relationship experience, we call it a secure attachment. If it happens later, as in psychotherapy, we call it an earned attachment. And today, I'm more secure than I was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15, and so on. In large part because of the hours that I've spent in therapy with a compassionate, capable, wise, empathic other. She said to me one time after I complained that the sessions are great, I have a great time, I have great insight, I think differently when I'm with you, is what I told her. But by the time I'm halfway home, it's fading already, it's gone. And she simply said, someday you'll carry around inside of me a copy. And that sounded weird and didn't fit with the way that I saw the world. But now I know. Now I have, to some degree, a copy of her, a voice. People share that with me often. They hear my voice, maybe because they've listened to a lot of these podcasts on their work, they start to hear the voice. It starts to reassure them. So if you stay in the paranoid phase in your life, the threat's always out there. The enemy is the other. But if you graduate, if you make it past that first phase, you get to what she called the depressed phase, where the only problem that you need to be dealing with are the ones inside of you. I love what James Hollis says when he talks about psychotherapy. He said, the chief obstacle in our therapeutic progress is who we have become up to this point. And most people, when I'm talking about therapy and talking about any of their relationships, I'm often saying they need you to be the bad one. Or they need the child to be the bad one, the scapegoat. They need to project it out there. They haven't made peace with their own self. They haven't really explored. They don't know themselves. And so they project out into the world the unconscious parts of themselves, the shadow self. And when we project out the shadow, the unconscious, the repressed parts of ourselves, they have become toxified. They become They become gremlins. They become monsters. Initially, when we repressed them, they were just needs. But now they become these ugly creatures that we see in other people. And we treat them as such. But in reality, they are us and we are them. It's all the same. And I'll talk about that more. So first we split off, then we project out. We project those parts onto others. Psychological projection is a defense mechanism where a person subconsciously denies split off parts of his or her own attributes, thoughts, and emotions, which are then ascribed to the outside world, usually to other people. Thus, projection involves imagining or projecting the belief that others originate those feelings. We think that they are causing our unhappiness. We think our struggling child with addiction is the source of our unhappiness. We think our spouse who works too much is the source of our unhappiness, on and on and on. Projection reduces anxiety by allowing the expression of unwanted, unconscious impulses or desires without letting the conscious mind recognize them. It is another way of managing our own discomfort. I heard somebody say just the other day that when we marry somebody, similar to what I talked about the other day on the podcast about marriage and intimacy, that we marry our unfinished business. We marry the person that we think will save us, that is the complement to our personality, that has developed the parts of ourselves that we haven't. And in the early phases, that's intoxicating and compelling. But eventually those differences turn and become ugly and difficult. This is the quote that I used the other day in the other broadcast, but it's so good I wanted to repeat it tonight. From James Hollis and the Eden Project, The Search for the Magical Other. He writes, all projection occurs unconsciously, of course. For the moment one observed, I have made a projection, one is already in the process of taking it back. More commonly, we only begin to reclaim our purchase on consciousness when the other fails to catch hold or reflect the projection. If there is an essential law of the psyche, it is that what is unconscious will be projected. This is why you observe that the quote that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. That's from Carl Jung. But since the psychic consists of a multiple of split off shards of energy, complex in its archetypal forms, virtually all of which are unconscious, there's always ample opportunity for projection. As I can never know the unconscious by definition or practice, so I can never know what energies may be acting out in the world. What we think, our hatred, our anger, our frustration, our dislike, the ones that we think are the bad ones, can tell us something about ourselves. They can tell us about the parts that we haven't explored. That's what our children do to us. That's what our spouses, they expose the parts of ourselves that we haven't integrated, that we haven't incorporated, that we haven't made peace with. This is what othering is. You know, I'm going to be rooting for the Dodgers in this World Series, although the Yankees are my favorite American League team. The Dodgers are my favorite National League team. I grew up in Southern California. Unfortunately, it was in Orange County, California, where the California Angels played baseball. So I was raised to be a California Angels fan, and I hated the Dodgers. They were the big brother who always beat up on us. They were the ones with all the success. It wasn't a rivalry because the Angels never did well, and the Dodgers were always the great LA team. But since I've moved away and I've reclaimed Los Angeles and the Dodgers as my team, I'm rooting for them. But I found myself just the other night watching one of their games. The World Series starts this Friday. I found myself watching the game the other night and watching Dodger fans, and I found myself literally judging people in the stands, remembering how much hatred I had for that otherness of that other team up there in Los Angeles. We see it in politics. We see it in marriage. We even see it in the parent-child relationship. When parents come to me and say, I don't understand them. Well, that to me is an invitation for me to try to explain them, to explain to the parent what's going on with the child the best that I can, if I can do it. But then they say it again and again and again. And that phrase, I don't understand, is in itself a projection. It's a shameful way of talking about somebody's otherness. When, on the contrary, if you knew yourself, if you've done your work, if you had explored the darkest recesses of your own psyche, you would see yourself in everybody. We create enemies. We dehumanize people. We turn them into objects. That's a way that we tolerate our pain, right? Hate and othering is simply a way to transform our pain and powerlessness and hurt into anger, which makes us feel less vulnerable, less fearful, less anxious. That's the temptation of anger and hate. Not that it's morally reprehensible or wrong or bad. That's the way the world talks about it. But that it is a defense against feeling, against grief, against loss and sadness and hurt. We become polarized. We see nothing of a similarity in the other. I see this, of course, we see this in countries, in political parties. We see this in marriage. We see this in the parent-child relationship. All of this splitting off and projecting out does well to remove the ambiguity and reduce life and people and circumstances into this simple binary of good and bad. No gray. Just us and them. Right? The Hatfields and the McCoys. The good guys and the bad guys. Winners and losers. And by reducing it into that simplistic, elementary, rudimentary form, we feel like we have control over it. Fundamentally, the human process of splitting and projecting is we want the badness to be out there. We want the explanation for the pain to be in somebody else or something out there, in the circumstances, in the tragedy that befell us. And of course, if you have a child that's hurting, you're going to be sad. If you have a marriage that is in conflict, that's going to be stressful. It's going to cause you distress. All of those things are true. I'm not talking about those temporary feelings that we go through. And by temporary, I mean those things can last weeks, months, and even years. I'm talking about this baseline of serenity, this baseline of peace, this baseline of, some people call it joy. I'm not a big fan of calling it joy because that can feel at times a little bit like happiness. And we know that happiness is fleeting and temporary. We want the badness out there. We want the problem to be out there. And while that makes us feel good, here's the bad news. If the problem is out there, the solution is out there. When in contrast, if the badness is in me, in here, then the solution is in here and in me. And then I have a project, something to work on, something to chip away at. So this shadow, this dark side, this place where we throw all of our psychic garbage, Carl Jung called the shadow. And a Jungian therapist once wrote, until the shadow is integrated into the personality, the world appears to be filled with opponents or adversaries who are actually products of our unconscious. Afterward, people can be seen as individuals who disagree with us. In my marriage, that went from making my wife a bad wife to making my wife a human wife who sometimes is scared and hurting. Further or deeper past projection, there's something called projective identification. Projective identification is a term first used by Melanie Klein to describe a process whereby parts of the ego are thought of as forced into another person who is expected to become identified with whatever has been projected. The projector strives to find in the other or to induce in the other, to induce the other one to become the very embodiment of the projection. I'm going to be helpless and I'm going to make you the guru. I end up getting frustrated with you because you're helpless, right? That first in a marriage or relationship, that might work out, but eventually it gets exhausting. And you start acting helpless. You start acting the way When I feel it in therapy, if I come away with in therapy, if I feel frustrated in therapy, if I feel angry, agitated, disgust, I'm using mostly feelings and sensations that we would term as unpleasant. I have a sense that that's something being played out between me and the client. I now know something about their internal world that I couldn't have known any other way. In the earliest days, Freud wanted this projective identification to be eradicated. In modern psychology, we use that as a source of information. I can find out about you in a sense by the way I feel about you, the way I feel in your presence. The primary difference between projection and projective identification is this induction. The recipient of the projection can suffer a temporary loss of insight, a sense of experiencing strong feelings, of being manipulated so as if they are playing a part, no matter how difficult to recognize in someone else's fantasy. When I experience projective identification, when I take on somebody's stuff, when it gets inside of me, oftentimes I can sense that. I felt fine going into the session. I felt fine before, but now I feel hopeless or sad or depressed. Sometimes I'll walk away from a session thinking, I have nothing of value to offer this world. Maybe I should quit. When those thoughts come into my head because of the feeling that I have, I know I've taken on somebody's stuff. And even though I can deconstruct it, the fact of the matter is I can't get rid of that feeling. I was just doing some supervision with a therapist just yesterday where they had taken on this huge weight of somebody's mental health issues. And after talking about it, the individual therapist said to me, but I still feel really bad. And I said, yeah, that's not going to go away for a while. It's going to dissipate. It's probably going to take another day. And that's why in relationships, it can be really helpful to step away. Joseph Campbell in The Power of Myth wrote, where you stumble, there lies your treasure. The very cave you are afraid to enter turns out to be the source of what you are looking for. The damn thing is in the cave that was so dreaded has become the center. And Carl Jung wrote, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. And I don't just mean strangers. I mean your children. I mean your spouse. We marry and we raise our projects. We raise people who expose parts of us that we have avoided. We marry people who eventually bring up the parts of us that we haven't dealt with, the less of all parts of ourselves. And we end up angry and resentful. We end up far apart. And I'm not saying you have to stay in any marriage or any relationship that doesn't suit you or that doesn't fit. But what I am saying is the work that you have is there no matter what. If the child or the spouse disappears, you still have the same work. If you decide to get a divorce, it's the same work as if you stay. When I have parents call me inquiring about our services or inquiring about potential treatment options for their children, I give them the information that they're asking for, and I eventually say, now that we've given you that information, read The Journey of the Heroic Parent. Start listening to the podcast. Come to a Finding You, because you'll be asked to do that work anyway, no matter where you send them. Even if it's the best, in fact, if it is the best program in the world, they will know that there's undone work in the entire system. So we begin to listen to these feelings, these symptoms, these projections. We begin to hear what they have to teach us. Charles Bukowski wrote, don't fight your demons. Your demons are here to teach you lessons. See, we've been told to be afraid of demons. But nothing is learned if you just run from them. Don't fight your demons. Your demons are here to teach you lessons. Sit down with your demons and have a drink and chat and learn their names and talk about the burns on their fingers and the scratches on their ankles. Some of them are very nice. Or more simply put, said by Rumi, the cure for the pain is in the pain. If you have a struggling child, if you're being triggered, there is your work. I thought about it last night. I was thinking about this after doing the supervision that I described. The goal is to teach clients to ask not just better questions, but bigger questions. Not how much screen time should I allow for my child, but who am I? What's my relationship to the child? Fundamentally, what's my role in this child's life? Fundamentally. And I'm not talking about the things you've been taught from your upbringing. I'm talking about finding the truth, finding what's true for you. If we do this deep work, if we do this exploration of self, we see ourselves everywhere. Carl Jung wrote, "What if I should discover that the poorest of beggars and the most imprudent of offenders are all within me, and that I stand in need of the alms of my own kindness, that I myself am the enemy who must be loved? What then?" Or Erik Erikson, a wonderful developmental psychologist who talked about the psychosocial stages of development that you would know about if you heard him. Trust and differentiation and figuring out who you are. He wrote, "The more you know yourself, the more patience you have for what you see in others." This idea of interbeing, that we're all connected. I don't know if you ever saw the movie Mask. It was about a young man with a birth deformity. His face was deformed, but he had really high intellect and one would say spiritual knowledge and insight. And he talked about this idea that the big lie that we all believe is that we're separate, that there is such a thing as other. When a great teacher was asked the question by one of his students, "How should we treat others?" he responded, "There are no others." Or as the Buddha says, if you truly loved yourself, you could never hurt another. Khalil Gibran said it this way. He said, "And God said, love your enemy. And I obeyed him and loved myself." And Jack Kornfield, the wonderful teacher, writer, and Buddhist, said, "If your compassion does not include yourself, it is incomplete." Self-compassion is the way. And self-compassion is not selfish. It's not self-indulgent. It's not a narcissistic project. It's just the opposite. Not looking for the good and the pretty parts, but understanding who you are. Like I said earlier, that's the thing in the way of what you want, is who you've become. So you've got to figure that out. And from there, everybody and everything else will make a lot of sense. Like I said, we need to ask different questions. We need to ask bigger questions in our work. From James Hollis, Carl Jung noted that neuroses is the necessary outcome when the infinite possibilities of the individual are subordinated to the restrictions of the culture. "I have frequently seen people become neurotic," he said, "when they content themselves with inadequate or wrong answers to the questions of life. Their life is not sufficient content, sufficient meaning, if they are unable to develop a more spacious personality than neurosis generally appears." That's what relationships do for us. They transform us, they expand us, they enlarge us. And that enlargement, that expansion, that transformation comes from suffering. But only if that suffering leads to this kind of self-reflection. In the case of psychotherapy, Jamie Gill wrote, "Part of the business of psychotherapy is to discover and create alternate experiences for thoughts, feelings, attitudes, and beliefs. This is undertaken," she writes, "in the service of freeing people to be able to re-experience themselves." You re-experience yourself in the presence of a therapist. In a safe but different context, she says. The virtue of talking to an empathic and accepting person who has a different base is that it quickly illuminates one's own. What was automatic and unconscious is now noticed and discussed. The world is allowed to become one of noticeable constructions. That's the work. The work is to find somebody, to find a context where we can be safe to be who we are and to explore it. It's messy. It's ugly. It's terrifying. We're going to have to come into contact with things that we've been told to hate or fear. But again, when we make peace with those aspects of ourselves, we realize that there was nothing to be afraid of. We fall in love with more of ourselves. And the more that we fall in love with more of ourselves, the more we fall in love with all of humanity. Adashanti wrote, anything you avoid in life will come back over and over again until you are willing to face it, to look deeply into its true nature. And Edward Edinger wrote, whenever one finds himself in a state of conflict with someone or a situation, he should entertain the hypothesis that the psyche has propelled him to that situation in order to generate consciousness. If you don't do the work to love your horrible, rotten self, I wrote, the parts of yourself that you discarded, that you were told were unacceptable, you'll project those aspects out onto others. You will think that the problems in your life are the fault of others. You will see the badness out there. The work is to own your feelings. Own the parts that you work against, that work against you. You must reclaim the parts you split off in order to survive. While this process can be painful, on the other side of it is hope, liberation, and even a greater love. And we love to hate our symptoms. They cause problems. They make a mess. They hurt people. They hurt us. So we love to hate them. And we've been taught that hatred is the cure. Without anyone ever saying those words, we have been taught that. But like the Buddha wrote or said, hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal rule. And the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh wrote, to love is, first of all, to accept ourselves as we are. Sadhguru wrote, when a child comes into your life, it's not a time to relearn life. When a child comes into your life, it is a time to relearn life, not to teach the child your ways. I get asked all the time, maybe more than anything from these podcasts, what do you mean when you say do the work? My favorite answer is embodied in this quote by Paulo Coelho. He wrote, the reward for our work is not what we get, but who we become. And I want to read this last to you as we take this home. I found this on my social media. The woman who wrote it looks like her name is Laura Matsu. Looks like this maybe is from X, at Laura Matsu is her handle. She wrote, the path of the ego, which is the part of us that wants to be good and right. The path of the ego wants may be much different than the path destined for the soul. Remember, the soul is not a literal ghost, but that part of us, that deep, knowing, divine part of us. The path of the ego wants may be much different than the path destined for the soul, which is why our lives are so full of certain crises, disappointments, and seeming failures. These experiences present an opportunity for rebirth. Many people refuse the opportunity for rebirth. Instead, they stay stuck and stagnant at these points of their lives as they blame others and the world for what they think has gone wrong and become more and more bitter with age. Yet for those willing to self-reflect and go inwards into these moments of despair, you'll experience a profound rebirth into the life you are meant to live and become more of a reflection of your true self and the essence of who you truly are. You can only undergo this process if you are willing to confront the dragons along the way, the false selves you've developed, the wounding that's driving you towards certain aims that are blocking the light of that essence from showing you the way out of the darkness. That's the work. This is the good news. The good news is that you're the problem and the solution. The good news is, especially today, you can find places, safe places to share yourself. You can go to a 12-step meeting for free. You can listen to this podcast. You can read my book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, or The Audacity to Be You, or any number of the books that I reference that talk about this work, that really aim not at fixing you, but at finding you. And when one is found, one fixes themselves. Everything falls into place. That is the work. It is a transformation. It is a rebirth. It is, in some cultures, it's called being born again. That's what was meant by that. It's so fundamentally different that it's best described as a death and a rebirth. All right, folks. We have the Finding You Intensive coming up. I can't recommend it enough. I'm going to be running the one in person December 4th through 8th. That will be the only one I'll be running for a while. I do these every so often. So if you're interested, that one is going to fill up December 4th through 8th. We also have an online version, half the time, a third of the cost, November 15th through 17th. And of course, we have a Finding You in January 15th through 19th. That's already starting to fill up. And January 24th through 26th is our online version. I'm going to be hosting a conscious parenting workshop. That's an all-day workshop on January 10th from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Mountain Time. And then I'm going to be teaching an attachment-based therapy class, a master class on attachment-based therapy, March 7th at 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. I didn't know when I started tonight what the name of the next broadcast would be, but I'm going to be talking about narcissism next week. So next Tuesday, a week from today, October 29th at 6 p.m., it will be on what really is narcissism and the narcissistic wound. One of my very favorite subjects, maybe perhaps because I'm intimately acquainted with it myself. I hope this is a helpful point of contact for you. And as always, for on behalf of the people that love you and the people that you love, thank you for showing up and being willing to do your work. Have a great evening. I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.